It's a question that's yet to be answered. Who must be held criminally liable for the deaths of 141 people from the Life Esidimeni clinic? Remember, they were transferred from that clinic. And that is the inquest that is currently underway. It's trying to establish. Former Gauteng Premier David Makhura was the latest to testify. He was before the inquiry today. You'll remember that mental health patients were transferred out of Life Esidimeni into many unlicensed, non-governmental organizations, and many of them continued on to get very sick, and over 140 dying. Makhura says today he was completely in the dark about what was actually going on. You'll remember that 2 weeks ago, former Health MEC Esidimeni alluded to the fact that both the former Premier and the former Finance MEC here in Gauteng, Barbara Creasy, were well aware of the situation. So let's bring in our reporter, Moloto, who's been monitoring this. Moloto, thanks so much for joining us. So yesterday you spoke to us about Barbara Creasy. She refuted what Esidimeni said. What did the former Premier have to say today?
Well, David Makhura, the former Premier of Gauteng, essentially echoed the same sentiments that were echoed by Barbara Creasy, saying that, yes, Esidimeni, as the MEC of Health, did make a presentation in a meeting of the so-called Premier Budget Committee, which Makhura chaired as the Premier, and there were a few MECs, including Creasy herself. And he says the understanding has always been clear that the department has taken a decision to reduce the number of bed usage from Life Esidimeni by about 20% in that particular year, and they would transfer that 20% of the patients into institutions that are owned by a government. He says there was never a mention of NGOs, that these patients would be taken to the NGOs. And at the time, he says they emphasize that whatever you do, make sure you do not compromise the quality of services these patients are receiving. Now, the defense obviously wanted to press him harder to say that you were aware. It's not like you were in the dark completely. And Mahlangu is insisting that you actually, that particular committee gave an instruction to the Department of Health to go and terminate the Life Esidimeni contract. And the former Premier saying that any decision, even making reference to some provisions of the Constitution that says any executive decision that is taken must be put in writing, and he must sign as the Premier, and also the MEC of the affected department ought to have co-signed with him, but also the MEC of Finance should have signed. Now, that did not happen, and because it did not happen, it could not have been that such a decision was taken. Maybe let's listen to former Premier David Makhura as he was expanding there.
You were told that the patients would be moved to state facilities, state health facilities, government health facilities, right?
Yes, what is referred there as departmental institutions is government or public health facilities.
Not private facilities.
Not private council. And
the health facilities in the department that would be used would not result in a deterioration in the quality of care to those patients. Is that right?
Certainly, Council. That was our emphasis.
So you say that was your emphasis?
It's not in dispute, Council. Everything about health.
Okay, so I want to move up from the minutes, you were there, you were present, so you can give us direct evidence, and so that's what I'm asking from you, is in relation to this particular topic of Life Esidimeni, whether you were given the assurance that the facilities would not result in a lower standard of care.
Certainly, yes, Council.
Who gave you that assurance?
The department.
Right, so he's very clear there. Former Premier also saying the reasons for moving patients to NGOs, he was just kept in the dark about that. Just explain how that came about.
So The decision to move obviously was, the presentation was made in September 2014 in that premier budget vote. But Makhura is saying it was not to move them to the privately owned NGOs. Now he says he then later, obviously the plan unfolded. It was, I think, in September 2016 when he says he was in the Val on a government outreach that his former spokesperson, Phumles Khonyane, whispered into his ear to say, Premier, are you aware the MEC of Health has just made an announcement in the legislature to say that 36 mental care patients have died? Are you aware of that? And he says, I was not aware. And I immediately, according to him, I said, let me finish this meeting I'm chairing. And then he phoned the MEC to say, let's meet. They met apparently 2 days later at his office. He says the MEC brought with her the entire entourage of officials, from the head of the department to other officials who were dealing with that whole process. And upon their arrival, he says the numbers have now changed. It appeared that the numbers, it's no longer 36. They have almost doubled 2 days later. So he started to even doubt the actual number of people who had died by then. And he wanted an explanation because he says for the first time, formally, he was told that these patients died in facilities that are owned by NGOs, privately owned NGOs. And he didn't understand why they were there in the first place. And what became a shocker was that the officials actually told him that it's a norm for that number of people to die in institutions that are catering mentally challenged patients. And he just didn't understand, he says. And they said sometimes the numbers would be higher. But then he wanted to understand, to say, why did you move them to privately owned NGOs? Because the agreement was that they would go to facilities that are owned by a government. Then he says the officials, in the presence of the MEC, because the MEC didn't have the specific answers, that is why he brought those bureaucrats. He says those bureaucrats said now that the reason they took them there to those NGOs was because they were implementing a national policy that dictated that mental care patients must now be taken to community-based NGOs. Now, Makhura is saying they could not have told me as Premier that the issue was because they did not have funding, because not even once did we ever cut or slash the budget of these particular programs. And those are some of the reasons that Mahlangu has been forwarding to this inquiry, but also to the arbitration that was chaired by retired Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke, that they were under financial constraints. We heard Barbara Greasy also saying issue of money can be an excuse. So today he now says it was for the first time and I was shocked, I was angry, and maybe let's listen to him as to how he reacted.
Yeah.
They didn't disagree with what the officials were explaining there. They didn't disagree. And I was particularly keen to understand that what those officials were explaining to me is what the department was doing, and I made it clear that. But that's what we have discussed at the PBC. You are now introducing something that's called the National Department. The national legislation. So obviously, I was clear that at the head of the department is the two officials who are now saying, the people who must explain this to you, Premier, why we are doing this. We brought our team here. They essentially, those officials were speaking on their behalf. They didn't distance themselves to what was being put forward there as the reason, a very strange reason, which was never brought to EXCO.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
They were present.
They were present, they were there.
So now we've got two high-ranking people, former high-ranking people in Gauteng saying Adani Mahlangu's version not correct. How soon before this inquest will lead us to criminal liability, do you think?
Well, it would be very difficult on my side to attach the timeline because this, as you know, is a court process. This inquest is being heard before the Pretoria High Court. But we have heard from the presiding officer, specifically yesterday, thanking Barbara Creasy to say that your testimony has been very helpful to this court. It answered so many questions that had been hanging there. So perhaps that is a cue that she now has all the answers before her. And hopefully, anytime soon, we will have the answers. But I know that tomorrow the inquiry is continuing. However, the inquest, however, Makhura has wrapped up his testimony. There's one professor who will be giving testimony there.
All right, thank you so much. Such an important issue, an issue of accountability and how we treat the most vulnerable people in our society. eNCA reporter Moloko Moloto there. Now,